that we want to achieve here. So we will have like 4 presentations right now in an alphabetical order. Nadia, then Peter, Mariana, and then me. Then we want to have a short input by Lucy, who is the liaison. And maybe that's where, Lucy, you can just say the 2-3 words about what is going to happen after the 4 presentations.
Sure, yeah. So the idea of the Liviana liaisons is to kind of bringing some lightness and creativity into these sessions, and to also create some nice output for the archives of the Community Economies Research Network. But then, rather than keeping notes of the session in academic terms, we are kind of experimenting with different creative formats. So I'm just gonna jump in after the presentations to collect some general impressions in the room, and yeah, and see what we can make out of that collectively and creatively.
Thank you so much, Lucy. I think all of us are really also somehow excited. How is this going to happen? Because we don't know it from the last Liviana sessions. And I hope it will be also refreshing, because we will right now have 4 presentations, which is like 15 minutes each. And we will give like 5 minutes for individual questions for each presentation. And then eventually, after this, let's say 80 minutes around, Lucy comes with this intervention. The remaining time we want to use for having a general discussion, on the one hand, facilitated by Peter. And secondly, and this is already something we drop, Nadia, Pete, and I, we are at the moment so excited about these ideas of past community economies that we even thought about at some point working on an edited volume that brings together various contributions on these past community economies. And our ideas about it are so far very fuzzy. So it can be actually territorially confined to the so-called post-communist world, but it can be also something larger. And we would be just curious to have a small discussion what you think where this book proposal could eventually lead to. But with this, I want to also close at least my introductory words. Pete, Nadia, if you want to add something right now, this would be the time. And meanwhile, I would ask Lucy to open the first presentation by Nadia. Did I forget anything, Peter or Nadia?
No, I don't think so.
I just wanted to mention that I will try to be keeping the time, so I'll be the timekeeper. And just no need to show it now, Lucy. I'll start with just me in my head, talking head, and then I will tell you. So,
Nadia, should I keep the time for you?
Sorry?
Should I keep the time for you? Should I tell you when you've got 5 minutes to go?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Okay, so well, I wanted to tell you a little bit about cooperatives before the war, cooperatives before communism, which existed in Czechoslovakia, and also a bit about my own story on how I came to learn about them and what it meant for me. So there'll be 2 parallel stories: the Czechoslovakian cooperatives before communism and my own story. The story starts in 2002, so about 20 years ago, when I arrived in Britain as an idealistic researcher who wanted to learn about a new economy, localized, community-owned, not only for profit, which I knew about from reading books in, for example, Richard Douthwaite's book Short Circuit and New Economics Foundation materials, which I was in contact with in London. I was looking even then for an antidote to capitalism, which had spread its wings in my country since 1989, since the so-called democratic revolution, but it was also a market revolution. So although by training I was an ecologist, I just wanted to learn more about these alternatives. I did about 50 face-to-face interviews with them and tried to find out what they do and how they work and how they are structured. And eventually I published a book with also had Czech examples, which was called Living in the Cracks. And this happened in 2005, but that's another story. The story here is about the cooperatives, which sort of took me by surprise. It had actually taken me a long time to reframe the word cooperative, because under communism, when I grew up under communism, the cooperatives were just part of the regime. They existed, but they didn't feel like an alternative. There were the unified agricultural cooperatives, rather infamous because in the 50s, 1.5 million of independent farmers were forced into 10,000 unified cooperatives and state farms with the land and the animals collectivized. And they had to work together whether they wanted or not. Plus, there were these large housing cooperatives, which emerged in the early 60s, already under socialism, building high-rise tower blocks. They helped a lot of people get flats, but they felt just like another arm of the state. So actually, in the 1990s, my vision of cooperatives already started changing, because a lot of the interesting alternatives in the West that I heard about were actually cooperatives. I learned there was a whole movement, and I learned a lot from my mentors, because the research project was under the New Economics Foundation in London. So I spoke about this with Richard Douthwaite, the author of The Short Circuit, with Pat Connerty from New Economics Foundation and others. So I decided that cooperatives can be cool, actually, are cool, provided they are authentic and depend or take their cue from the 7 cooperative principles anyway. So I was studying these British cooperatives on my sabbatical with the kind of rising enthusiasm, and one day I came to this cooperative, a small library near Oxford, and I found this dusty cardboard box, and in it there was written cooperatives in Czechoslovakia, and I thought, what's this? And it turned out to be scholarly articles from the 1920s, 30s, or even earlier. And to my surprise, I found we actually had a thriving cooperative movement in my country before the Second World War, which was forcibly extinguished after the communist takeover in 1948. I even unearthed a book by this Czech cooperative official called Ladislav Fajráben, which was focused on rural, or as they called them, agricultural co-ops. And he wrote this in English in Washington, D.C. in 1952, after he had dramatically escaped from the secret police who had come to arrest him after the communist coup in 1948. And so I made a copy and took it home, and actually in the book I found out for the first time why these unified agricultural cooperatives were called unified, because they had actually subsumed the authentic co-ops which had existed before. Their assets were frozen and they were forced to enter the unified cooperative, agricultural cooperatives. So that was just one interesting thing I gleaned from this book. So now, Lucia, if you could please put on I'll show just a few slides for a few minutes, and then I'll come to some conclusion. So yeah, Czechoslovakian cooperatives and me. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, this is just the cover of the Short Circuit book, which was such an important influence in my life, by Richard Douthwaite, written already in 1996, not so well known now, but available online anyway. Next one, please. This is the Living in the Cracks book, which actually appeared in 2005. And I even reframed some Czech enterprises to be seen as alternatives. Next one, please. Yes, and here we are already with the cooperatives. So this is some data from the Fajráben book. There was an awful lot of these cooperatives in Czechoslovakia. There were, in 1938, Czechoslovakia had about 15 million inhabitants. There were these rural non-credit cooperatives, so there were electrification cooperatives, producer marketing cooperatives, almost over 5,000. Then there were very special rural credit cooperatives, Kampelichkas, again over 4,000, which actually eliminated usury in Bohemia and Moravia, and which had most of the people in the village participating. They were based on voluntary work. And then there were other credit co-ops in the towns and cities. And then there were many non-rural co-ops, including cultural co-ops, theaters. All these had a cooperative structure quite often. Over 3,000, so the total of 16,000. So that was about 1,000, one cooperative per every 1,000 inhabitants. Can you show the next slide? So here is an illustration from a book published in 47, and there is actually illustrations from, again, based on Czechoslovakian cooperatives. This first one was a cooperative power station. It's based on the town Dražice nad Jezero, which was really an eco village. We could call it, well, not eco because they were not ecological, but it was a village of cooperation, something the Rajday pioneers had in mind when they first started, because there were many cooperative enterprises in this village and they collaborated together. It was the agricultural cooperatives which really had later their own mills and their own energy cooperatives as well. And the second little picture is a drawing of a typical kampelička, which, as I said, was very important in the life of the villages. Actually, if they had, they did take interest, but not much, because, as I said, the costs were not high, and they actually use their surplus for support of the community, planting trees or maybe lending money for building a new school and so on. Okay, so the next picture, please. Reading the Feyerabend book on that far-off day in the Oxford library, I read this. It's the conclusion of his book, because he also described how they were dismantled, these cooperatives, which were really for him very important. So he says, it is true that the story of the Czechoslovak agricultural cooperative now has a sad ending, but it's not the finale. And the magnificent example of that whole cooperative movement and its achievement remains to demonstrate what can be done in these areas of the world where man's situation calls for change and improvement. The true cooperative spirit is the sound basis of every democracy and of all democratic institutions anywhere in the world. It lies in the hearts of all men of goodwill and cannot be destroyed, not even by communists in Czechoslovakia. It lives. And I must say, I actually cried when I read that, and I thought, so this was just waiting here for me, and I must do something. I must at least translate it back into Czech. And this actually happened. I came home, and in the end, there's another long involved story involving a green knitted dress, which my mother owned and which turned out to have been knitted by the wife of the nephew of Ladislav Feyerabend, who had remained in Czechoslovakia, and they were, of course, persecuted. So she had to make a living like this. And the next picture. Yeah, we actually did translate it into Czech and published it. But I'm still not very happy, because this knowledge about these cooperatives has not seeped into consciousness. Pete, how much time do I have?
You have another 10 minutes.
Okay, so I've saved some time. So
9.5.
Sorry?
9.5.
9.5. So yeah, we did translate it, but it wasn't a bestseller, and still feel that most people have no idea at all about these cooperatives. And if I am to come to some conclusion on a personal level, it was like the story of going there and back again, or the search for a treasure, in which the hero of the story usually goes out and looks for something, searches for a treasure far and wide, and in the end finds out that the treasure is actually buried under his or her own hearth. And the same thing really happened to me, because when I came to Britain. I was looking for something in the West, as we all were at that time, and I found that I actually had a treasure in my own sort of backyard, so to speak. So on a personal level, it was this experience, and it was not only that, it was other things which I discovered comparing with Britain that were better in my country in terms of community economies, let's say, such as greater rootedness in place, greater trust on a family village level, and so on. But so this was a really life-changing experience for me, and the fact that there was this gigantic sphere of cooperatives, which of course also had their issues and problems. I just painted a rosy picture, but if we went deeper in the discussion, we could discuss that. And on a more general level, the conclusion would be that I feel that this same issue happened in many, I mean, the same thing happened in many Eastern Bloc countries, that there was some kind of interesting past which we could sort of look to inspire us for our community economies building and transition to a non-capitalist future. But they are buried because cooperatives, the communists dislike cooperatives. For them, they were just something. The best was state ownership. The worst was private ownership, and cooperatives were something in between, but they were not really real cooperatives, real democratic cooperatives, as they couldn't be under a totalitarian regime. And the capitalists don't like cooperatives either. So nobody really liked cooperatives in the last many decades of our history. So I think on a general level, I would conclude that it is time now, I think, for us to dig where we stand, or to dig deeper and to look at these alternatives which existed in our own areas. I think we would, not only the Czechs, but the other people from the Eastern Bloc, and maybe other countries as well, looking at what they had in the past, to have more confidence in building new economic structures which are really needed. So I think that was the conclusion. Thanks for listening. Oh, Pete has the short circuit. Okay, so now the discussion, right? So you will be facilitating that, Pete. So anybody, yeah, just raise your hand.
I thought we were going to go straight through the 4 papers first, and then have the.
We had actually decided that there would be 5-minute discussion after each.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah. So, who'd like to make a comment? Shall I use chair's privilege? I always like listening to you, Nadia, because you and I know exactly the same people from exactly the same time, including Richard Douthwaite and Pat Connerty and all these people. And you're inspired by my country, where I listen to the UB40 song. I'm a British subject, not proud of it, while I carry a burden of shame. So I see capitalism, exploitation, imperialism, domination. You know, we are the people that decided to give somebody else's country away to someone else through the Balfour Declaration. So it's very hard to look under your own hearth, and I'm glad you are inspired by some of the sort of cooperative spirits that came from the Rochdale pioneers. And I think it's probably that I see more in communism in a very naive way, as somebody who hasn't had the secret police ever knocking at the door. And I think those kind of intercultural conversations are how we all really learn from each other. So thank you for that. Who else would like to comment? Marcus?
I must just have a short question. Did you recently hear in Czechoslovakia that some, I don't know, cooperatives are established, and with reference also to a proud, I don't know, Czechoslovakian past? Or is this something that at least you didn't encounter or also research or engage with?
Yes, I encountered one consumer cooperative in North Bohemia, which actually harks back on its website and in its discourse to the 1890s, and which actually says we were founded then, and for us communism was just a episode, and we are safeguarding the assets we have for the future generations in our cooperative. So that's quite encouraging, but it's quite rare.
Hey, Tom.
We don't hear you.
Yes, Tom.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm having audio issues, so it's cutting off quite regularly, actually. So, yeah. I was just wondering about the journey of cooperatives to Czechoslovakia earlier, so Austro-Hungary or First Republic. What is that history of? Is it from the UK, or is there something longer term in the history that it was building on, or just for someone who hasn't read that book, like where does the book start from? Sort of is the question, I guess.
Now, which book you mean? Sorry.
I assume the Berabant one, the one you translated.
Oh yeah, Feyerabend actually starts with the late 1890s, 1880s, when the first Raiffeisen, the German minority in my country, started these Kampeličkas, which were the Czechs copied it. The German ones were Raiffeisen banks, and the Czech ones were called Kampeličkas, and then it slowly grew. And actually, during the First World War, they got a big boost because the government somehow asked the regional centers of the farmers' cooperatives to distribute grain or something like that. So the government in this case helped a lot, and the big boom was between the wars. So he describes all this, but he keeps his emphasis on the agricultural or rural cooperatives because that was his sort of work. He actually worked for most of the time in a big organization, which was a big organization, trading organization, which was started by one of the, again, big umbrella groups of the farmers group, because they were powerful. And here again is something, they weren't really alternative in the sense of now, they weren't critical of let's say, chemical fertilizer, and so they actually imported guano from South America and so on. So they had this idea of improvement. At the same time, there was a big sort of this big idea of collectivism and democracy, which is, I think, we could build on.
Okay, thank you very much. Shall we move on?
Okay, so then now it's you, Pete. So should I tell you you have 4 minutes to go then?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay, so over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. I don't have any PowerPoints to share, or I do have, but I don't think they add anything. So I will just take through this. I'm interested in the idea that from the diverse economies perspective, we don't believe that we should be capitalist-centric, which means we don't think that everything that happens is determined by capitalism in a very structuralist way. But that doesn't mean we say that capitalism doesn't matter. We just want to put it in our place. In similar ways, nobody argues that if you're living in a settler state with a history of colonialism, that doesn't matter. It just doesn't dominate and control everything. I'm interested in the experiences of places that had what they were told was communism, the extent that that matters, and I think it does. But as a Brit, I don't want to say exactly how it matters. I just want to refuse to know too much and ask questions from people in the area and find out what they think, which is why I love talking to Nadia, and I'd like to talk to more people about that. Yeah. And my experience is that when I read polls, and I'm talking about Poland, I'm not talking about all of East Central Europe or every communist party, every communist place, because the communism had different levels of legitimacy in different places. And in Poland, its level of legitimacy it had was very, very low. In other places, it had high levels of legitimacy. So polls talk about a lingering smell or a lingering stench of communism that suggests that anybody that was in any way implicated with communism is probably not fit to be in polite society now. So it's a very anti-communist environment in Poland. So I think there's lots of evidence that its experiences last, and they are bad experiences. And perhaps I'm being very naive, but I'd like to suggest there is perhaps a more inspiring story of workers' struggles during the People's Republic of Poland that I think we can learn from. So I'm particularly interested in the part of diverse economies thinking that's that where we got the 5 blocks that we talk about, where we talk about the enterprise, alternative forms of labour, alternative forms of property, alternative forms of transaction, alternative forms of market. I'm interested in alternatives to the enterprise. So not just the capitalist enterprise, the multinational, the family firm, the public company, the unincorporated company. Interested in alternative forms of capitalist firms and the extent that they are capitalist, like environmentally responsible firms, SMEs, lifestyle firms, but also some of the non-capitalist examples like worker cooperatives, community enterprises. So that's what I'm particularly interested in. And I think they're interested because they might be, first of all, places where we can negotiate our independence. They're an organisational form where we can say this is how we want to live differently. So I think the social and solidarity economy is incredibly important there. And I love Ethan Miller's work on this because I think that really matters. I think it's also important if we're thinking about a diverse economy. I don't want to think of a diverse economy as something where the large firms will always be capitalist. You know, will car makers, helicopter makers, fridge makers, plane makers always be capitalist firms? Or can we envisage a way where they are post-capitalist firms, but making the high-tech stuff that I think we need if we're going to avoid dangerous climate change? And I think there's an interesting story that you can get from Poland if you take the sympathetic view that in 1944, the Red Army, with armies composed of Poles, did throw the Nazis and the German bourgeoisie out of Poland and had a chance to do something different and interesting that we must acknowledge went very wrong. But what were the debates in the Polish People's Republic if you take the view that we can run an economy for ordinary people, for the producers, not where we're all getting jobs for capitalists? So I want to put my cynicism to one side and not to talk too much about repression and the gulags, while acknowledging, of course, it's there. But I'm interested in the ideas are there. And you can see a few different versions of what you might call self-management in Poland. And I call them abandonment, pragmatic crisis management, challenge, transformation, and closure. So I'll talk you through those. So if we think of Poland in 1944, the Red Army had just piled through. The country was ravaged by war. Generally in Poland, the bourgeoisie was generally German or Jewish. Obviously, Jewish people had been annihilated in the Holocaust. So it was a chance to do something new. And in the early years, basically, when the country was trying to get back on its front foot, this was workers' self-managed reconstruction from below. Basically, working people were taking over the factories that were there and trying to get the country going. And the communists said, yeah, we're not in a position to do anything about it. So that was a very creative part of the Polish self-managed experience. And it's perhaps the bit that's closest to the Argentine experience of the 2001 crisis, where capitalists disappeared in some places and working people took over their factories and managed them from below. You then got the coups after 1948, where Stalinism was introduced, and obviously that had everything to do with defending the Soviet Union from what it called imperialism. and a free Poland on the way to Russia would not be tolerated by the Soviet Union in any way, shape or form. So communists would argue that that's a pragmatic response. That's what you've got to do. Other people would say it's totalitarian, and obviously I would side with the latter view of that. But that was interesting because what the communists thought they were doing is that you could throw out the bourgeoisie and then you could manage the entire place like one big office or one big factory for working people. And that was the Stalinist period. Absolutely no role for self-management in that. And that can be interesting because I think in diverse economies, we've always got to ask ourselves, to what extent do people want to be involved in the basic rules about how they live their lives? How much do they want to be involved in ethical discussions about how we want to live well, or do they want to get on with their lives? 1956, you had the end of Stalinism, you had the revolt in Hungary and revolt in Poland that didn't end as badly as it did in Hungary. But the response to that was that the communists did introduce workers' councils, saying we do need to give working people a say in the process. Very, very quickly after 1957, 1958, these were diluted into what were called self-management conferences. And you'd find that there would be this person from the youth wing, this person from the Communist Party, this person from the town council, this person from this organization on these management councils. So they were diluted. What that meant for the next sort of 20 years is that Polish workers were completely cynical about arguments about self-management at the enterprise level. Very different from the situation in Germany, where there was, the system of co-determination, which was embedded pretty well. And I think that cynicism about cooperation and about co-determination, about self-management, is something that we need to take on board, and it's not something you get in other places. And then you
mean East Germany or West Germany when you said German?
West Germany.
Okay, thanks.
West Germany, be clear. So you then got sort of 20, 30 years of what you might call shopping trolley politics. In Britain, the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, everybody says he was unable to make a decision. He's varying from this way to the other way. In communist Poland, you got that as well, which I don't think you got in Czechoslovakia, and I don't think you definitely didn't get in Hungary, where you got decision-making that was fairly solid about goulash communism having a light touch, which meant you then got the eruption in 1980 of solidarity. And that's where I came on the scene, being a little younger than Nadia. I was 18 in 1980. And I remember solidarity very, very clearly, and I was inspired by solidarity. I thought the eruption at the Lenin shipyards was completely what I was about. And I remember that there was a Christmas #1 in Britain, and it was a series called The Festive 50 by a famous DJ called John Peel. And #3 that year was a song by Joy Division called New Dawn Fades. And he said, we're thinking of everybody in Poland right now as martial laws introduced, and these ideas are closed down. But there was a period of 2 years where you got 5 very interesting sets of debates about how working people can be involved in managing large-scale enterprises that are very important. Firstly, there was the solidarity in the first few months, which was a trade union. Absolutely. Working people need to be defended against managers who will make their decisions, and we don't get involved with self-management because it's not to be taken seriously. It's been abused by the communists. It's a farce. It's a joke to cover up exploitation of working people. And there's a big debate in diverse economies thinking about how much self-exploitation does go on in cooperatives and in worker-run enterprises that is worth bearing in mind. So workers should have a say, but as a trade union. The communists, and I think it's important to remember that there were lots of people in the Communist Party that believed in it, and believed that communism was the way to develop an underdeveloped country like Poland, where the bourgeoisie in the 1930s hadn't give a damn about the country, that did believe in a people's Poland. And they were not
4 more minutes.
4 more minutes. And they said that what we can do is refound socialism by having working people having a genuine voice within limits. So make the conferences real. There was a third group of people called the Network, and they were socialist enterprise managers, and they basically had been reading Hayek, and they believe that if you don't own a factory, you can't be managing it properly. So they wanted to completely move to a market economy. Third group of people, the Lublin group, they really looked at Yugoslavia, and they said, let's have a self-managed socialist republic where there will be a second chamber of the Polish parliament, which would be composed of representatives of the enterprises. And they would plan the economy. They continue to plan the economy, but in a much more decentralized and democratic way. The fourth group was nationalists. For them, self-management would be an independent Poland, a self-managed republic, which would be a Poland which would chuck the Ruskies out. And that's what self-management meant for them. The difficulty was that after martial law, this diversity of ideas died. It was seen as completely unrealistic, and everybody stopped reading, who'd ever read any Marx, stopped reading Marx and was reading Hayek and taking on Hayek's ideas and saying we need a marketized economy. So you read stuff by idealistic Westerners, and I'm an idealistic Westerner myself, like Naomi Klein, who talk about the shock doctrine and act as if the nasty capitalist West was imposing capitalism on Poland. That's actually a little bit of a travesty. The Polish side were arguing for a quick jump to the market economy, feeling that if they didn't do that, the communists would carry on as some sort of spider web or shadow network that will be controlling things. And that's the discourse that the right PIS in Poland still uses, that the problems of Poland are due to a communist hangover. It's a joke, it's a laugh, it's due to the problems of free market capitalism, not due to any lingering communist issue. But these ideas still last. And I think that matters. So everybody thinks that freedom is the capitalist free market. Ideas of social democracy put forward by Lewica don't have a lot of takers. They got 8% in the last votes. The liberals now are talking about economic liberalism and social liberalism. So nobody telling you what to do with your enterprise and nobody telling you what to do with your body. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of taking for social democracy. But what I'd like to know a little bit more about is whether there's connections can be done in post-socialist countries about valuing more the free market sides of diverse economy thinking, but adding the economic democracy side to it. So there's a book called Socialism After Hayek, which basically argues, and this is by an American Hayekian scholar, who argues that the future is free markets but economic democracy. So all firms should be run in a democratic way, and then that's enough of the democracy to put that together with markets. I think that would be interesting. There's a Polish cooperative I've looked at that is a cooperative model, and they say this is a good business model. They don't say we're going back to pre-war Polish ideas of cooperatives. They say this is a good business model. It works. So do we want to explore a little bit more about that? So can we put together the interesting things we say as diverse economy scholars about entrepreneurialism, about markets, about democracy, and that is a mix that might work well in a place that is not receptive to ideas that this is thinking about socialism and by the way, guys, what you had wasn't communism, don't you realize that? I think that might be worth exploring in a bit more detail. Is that me, Nadia?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
15 minutes. Okay, thank you as well, Pete. Thanks. And now we have 5 minutes for discussion. So please.
Go for it, Tom.
Mariana.
Can you?
Yes, yes. Thanks, Pete. Also thinking about Nadia's presentation, and what comes across to me is that you know, the conversations about those alternative economic forms are exceptionally complex. You know, they're complex because they kind of jump outside of those two alternatives that we are used to, right? So we have capitalism, and then we have socialism, communism, whatever people would call them, and there is nothing in between. But as soon as you kind of try to open those things up, you run into significance of place. Being a geographer, so I'm always thinking about significance of place, what is going on in a particular national context, and so on. And I was just struck by you know, this thought that those discourses, the complexity of those discourses really is augmented and multiplied in so many ways by what is specific to a particular country. Like those two examples that we right now heard have very, very different relationship with the alternative forms of the economy, right? And kind of tied to conservative or more progressive thought or whatever. I'm just saying so much is there to sort out. So thank you.
I think what's interesting, I've been reading a guy called Władimir Brus, who's a Polish communist economist that was thrown out the country in 1968. And reading his stuff now, you get the sense that for a communist, communism is centralization and state planning. And anything about diversity or markets or cooperatives is seen as capitalist. And they just, you know, he says the word market has so many unpleasant connotations for so many communists, and we don't buy that. And then I was in Bratislava a couple of weeks ago, and I did a presentation at a social centre there, and I was drinking beer convivially in the evening with a Hayekian, and we had a very good conversation about, you know, the Hayekian concept of the embedded market in concepts like the common law and custom and practice, and no argument against having, you know, workers' democracy and then a market. Now, their argument was, you know, and it's a good one, and it's probably right, that state planning can't understand all the diversity of choices individual people make. The market's best at that, and we, you know, I think as diverse economy scholars, we recognise that, and I think that really helps when thinking of progressive futures.
I think that would be a long discussion, because I'm not sure the market is really best at finding out what's best. But anyway, I just had two comments. One was regarding what you said about the people really wanted the capitalism themselves, so to speak, in Poland at least. In a way, it's true, but also I was just reading this book, Aftershock, A Journey into Eastern Europe's Broken Dreams by John Pfeffer. And he did a lot of interviews with a lot of people in the so-called Eastern Bloc, and in the 90s and then later. And his point is that, and the same came with us, there was just this ready-made sort of model which came in. The Poles invited Jeffrey Sachs, and the Czechs had Václav Klaus, who had already translated Nordhaus and Samuelson economics textbooks before the revolution, and they just came up and said, look, we're the economists, you know, we know what to do. And the dissident said, okay, yes, please tell us what to do. So there was also, I was on the New Economics Foundation list at that time, and they sent us ideas about workers' ownership and so on, but we weren't just not ready for it. I didn't really understand what it meant, you know. So it was also that there was just this model, and the ideas which now we see, we just wouldn't have them. So that was one comment, and the other comment, there's a Czech, very interesting Czech text about the loci of power in a communist enterprise, which was written by this guy who was actually in the management of these communist enterprises in Czech Republic in the 80s, 70s. And it's very interesting because there was a vacuum of power. The enterprises were really subsumed by the state, but there was power of another kind. There was sort of hidden power in which the enterprises, the factories, sort of blackmailed the government in certain ways. So, and there was very much concentrated power in management, but it was never mapped, and it wasn't visible, and it wasn't sort of controllable, really. So that's a very interesting also thing.
I could talk hours about that. I read a very interesting ethnography of a Polish factory in Poznan in the 50s, and Alec Nova and Władimir Brus are both really good at that, arguing that socialist enterprise managers had all sorts of power and there were all sorts of negotiations, and to say that you don't, as a free market person would say, you don't look after anything if you don't own it. I mean, socialist enterprise managers did, think that their own issues very well. Yeah, when I'm saying the people, I don't mean the people. I mean the Solidarność intellectuals that negotiated with the West. They were not people that the evil West just rolled over and imposed on them like a Chilean coup. They were into this. Martial law was such a shock that everyone was saying, how can you take these arguments seriously? And they said, to arguments like, those of the New Economics Foundation, these idiots are coming over asking us to try things that haven't worked in their own country. You go home, do it in your own country, and then come and show us that it works. And of course, we know there's loads of examples of cooperatives that work. I mean, John Lewis, one of our biggest employee-owned department stores, has been going for 100 years. So this stuff does work. I've got more of a problem with sort of naive views that the evil West imposed it on the East and it was a one-way debate, whereas the negotiators in Poland had agency. Yeah.
Okay, so I think, is there any more burning questions? So in that case, thanks, Pete, and it's over to Mariana, please. Mariana.
Thank you, Nadia. So in this presentation, I just wanted to share some remarks about, this kind of historical arc of those kind of community economies, solidarity economies, economies of cooperation that have played a significant role in Russia as well. But before I go, let me just say a couple of things. So I grew up in the former Soviet Union, right, and came to Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts to do my PhD in 1990. So by the time I came to Clark, I was like totally anti-Marxist, right? So I was all for, market economy, not because I was thinking about it as having anything to do with exploitation, but because it was an alternative to the Soviet system that has been very, very bad. And so I come to Clark University, and Clark University, I don't know if you know, guys, so this is the university geography department, which has one of the longest radical geography traditions in the United States. And basically, I am exposed to Marxism, and I'm thinking like, what are people doing? You don't understand, like, what is going on? And then, at some point it started clicking. It started clicking. And so basically what I would describe myself as going, using also Pete's language, going from Marx to Hayek to Marx, but, not to just Marx, but to anti-essentialist thinking about Marxism, which is exemplified by diverse economies tradition. And both Julie Graham and Kathy Gibson actually have their PhDs from Clark University as well. So there is a lot of kind of thinking about it. And this is when I also was exposed to feminism, for example, not as some kind of caricature of thinking, but an analytical perspective as well as Marxism, right? Critical analytical perspective on what is going on. So that was interesting. Also, in the last probably 15 years, I've been working with 3 more colleagues, Malika Safri, Craig Borowiak, and Stephen Healy from other universities on a project that we call Mapping the Solidarity Economy in the United States. And we are finally completing, gosh, I hope that it will be done, the book, which is called Solidarity Cities. And it looks at the geographies of solidarity economies in 3 US cities, in New York, in Philadelphia, and in Worcester. And it also considers them in the social context of class and race. And the idea here is that on the one hand, solidarity economies, or alternatives to capitalism, they provide collective means of resistance to racial capitalism. And this is very, very important concept in the context of the United States, maybe not so important in Europe, but it is very, very important here. So they provide means of collective resistance to exploitation, especially racialized forms of exploitation. But at the same time, it is not just reaction. It is also a way for people to build the new world, to kind of to build the world in which they want to live. So this kind of tension is very, very important. And it kind of also related to this other tension, like, are those solidarity economies new? Is it something new? Because a lot of, I think, critical scholars in the United States want to think of those things as alternative, like new alternatives to capitalism. Like, we've been living under capitalism for so long. Now, finally, we want to do something else. So this is the new thing. This is the new alternative. But what I also came to think about, that those alternatives, they are not new alternatives. So these are the ways that people have organized their economic lives, especially under conditions of duress, economic hardship, discrimination, or whatever it is, for centuries and centuries and centuries. So then it's like, how do we talk about those things, right? So this is not necessarily a new thing, but it is very, very important way for people to live their lives. So, and I think it kind of is relevant to the topic of this panel, right? So now we are trying to look at forms of diverse or solidarity or social economies, economic alternatives in the context of post-socialist countries. So, so here, I'm just going to sketch a few things, because I haven't, I mean, I did some historical work, but it's not like very, very deep work. This is what I am excited and I would like to do. So I'm just going to say a few things that I would love to hear some feedback to. So talking about Russia more specifically, now I understand that it is not like a discovery. This is a common thread. In Russia, of course, they had many forms of collective economic well-being, right, and living together for centuries and centuries and centuries. So this is not something that appeared in 19th century even. This is not something that I kind of survived Soviet period. This is not something that may have flourished now. This is a longer trajectory. And just to give you some examples, for example, in rural areas, for a very long time, there was an institution which is called MIR, M-I-R, and MIR in Russian also stands for the world and also stands for the peace. But this third meaning of that word is this kind of self-management organizations in villages in Russia who were involved in negotiating the terms of economic production with landlords, aristocracy who actually owned the land. So peasants did not own the land. The village would be sitting on the land of a landlord. But the villagers had to then pay either in kind, right, or in terms of labor to the landlord in order to justify their existence on this land. And it would be those organizations of mir, right, that would actually distribute the labor among the villages so that the village as a collective, as a whole, could kind of meet the terms, but also have protection. And they also were making sure that the surplus that was left to them after landlord would take majority of it was distributed in such a way that all village members could survive. They also played an important role in designating who of the villagers, and usually those would be kind of younger men, could go to the city and work there to bring on a temporary basis and bring back cash income. In Russian, this is called отход. So this is very, very important economic practice of survival, because what is happening within the village does not bring much cash. And so a lot of villagers would go to cities, live there temporarily, and then come back. And what is also interesting, in the post-Soviet period, when economy collapsed, this отход, or going to the city to bring cash home, became again a very, very mass movement. But this is a separate story. So then in urban areas, there was another form which was traditional to Russia and which appeared supposedly since, like, was mentioned in some sources since 14th century. And this is what is called artel. And artel is basically a union of people who come together in order to accomplish a particular task. So, for example, it could be a short-term project. Okay, we are going to build this house. So workers come together and they build this house. It could be seasonal organization. So let's say for the whole summer, we are going from one place to another and we participate in those activities. Or it could be even permanent. And the idea of artel was it was based on cooperative principles. And it was also self-managed. And they would elect a person who would be responsible for kind of managerial tasks to make sure that artel accomplishes its goal. And supposedly artels were like very, very widely spread in all kinds of areas. For example, they had them, there were mason artels, carpenters, smiths, construction workers. There were artels formed by women, for example, female vendors, also female translators, interpreters, right? So they also would create that. Artels also would be formed by artists, you know. 4 minutes left, okay. And so on. So those were very, very, very important ways to self-organize the economy. And but just to give you some statistics. So for the beginning of the 20th century, so this is right before the October Revolution, arguably Russia had the first place in the world in terms of the number of different kinds of cooperatives and also of their membership. So it was one of, like, it was the leading country in the world. And the numbers here are very big, you know, like dozens of thousands of different cooperatives. I'm not going to say them now, but this is very, very important point. Russia had cooperative congresses. They had 2 of them where, you know, people would come together to discuss the future of this movement. They also formed Moscow People's Bank specifically. So that was not government-backed bank, it was a capitalist bank. This is in addition to all kinds of credit unions and mutual aid societies and all this kind of stuff. And all this was gone practically after the October Revolution. Okay, some forms survived, but only until 1956. After 1956, all non-state forms of economic life were totally eliminated, except for collective farms that were obviously controlled by the state, and some artels that existed in kind of producing crafts, you know, and that's it. All other things were totally gone. So, looking back at this experience of Russia, this makes me think about the following things. So, this kind of community economies in Russia, they were very, very widely spread, right? And they also are linked to traditional forms of economic organization that even predated this more kind of modern forms of, as we know them, cooperatives and all this kind of stuff. So another very important point is that they are grassroots, you know, so those forms, people create them themselves, right? This is not something which is created necessarily through policy or whatever. We know today in many countries of the world, thank God, there are policies that support those forms, but those forms are grassroots in their origin. So another important point is that they do respond to community needs. They are there to protect people, right? I think they do provide this means of collective resistance, but at the same time, they are not driven by considerations of profit maximization. For example, they are not driven by considerations of total control. They have to be also democratically self-managed in one way to another. So, so I think it is absolutely worthwhile to look into those past forms of community economies. And it is very important to recover this past in order to empower the community economies of today, okay? Because as somebody, I think Nadia, you mentioned that under Soviet systems, those forms were not popular, the state didn't like them. But also we do know that capitalism doesn't like them either. So they are in this kind of double bind. Even though for centuries, this is exactly what allowed people to survive and to provide for livelihoods, right? Without the need to become wealthy, without the need to whatever. So for me, it is more a kind of condition of humanity, natural way of doing things, as opposed to what Hayek and other Milton or whatever it is, neoliberal economists would tell us is utility maximization. Like clearly, it's not utility maximization that drives most people in this world. It is this kind of way to have to live well, right? But not to live well, not in terms of wealth, but in terms of doing what you want to do to support your family, to be part of the community. And these are very, very important things. And they're kind of falling out of our consideration when we think about capitalism or totalitarian states. So those were my thoughts. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we have 5 minutes for discussion. Lucy?
Thanks, Mariana. That was super interesting and kind of a similar question that Nadia got, whether you see some of these kind of old community economies come back in some form, or, you know, if there are community economies in current Russia, what are kind of the inspiration sources, or what are the narratives around it, and are they in some ways kind of linking to these earlier traditions?
Mm-hmm. This is a very complicated question, because as we kind of agreed, right, that neither capitalism or totalitarian state likes community economies. And what you have in Russia today is a combination of both, right? So you have totalitarian state, basically, and you also have capitalism. So in current imagination of of Russia, there is no room for those kinds of forms, right? Because the whole energies are there to revive nationalism, imperial thinking, and this kind of glorify the state, and also glorify those kind of big industrialists that also existed kind of in the past, but today these are all this kind of Putin's oligarchs and this kind of stuff. So in terms of the state promoting it, no. At the same time, those forms, you know, they kind of seep in anyway, because this is what people want to do. And my past research on practices of property in Russia has established that despite the huge effort that post-Soviet Russia made to establish private property, right? There was no private property at all in the former Soviet Union, which is different from some other countries of Eastern Europe, where a certain kind of limited form of private property ownership existed. In Russia, there was zero, right? There was personal property, but not private property, the way kind of we know it. So the whole policy, like thrust of the policy of transition was to establish this private property. But what we find is that instead of one single institution of private property, multiple practices of property emerged as a result. So, and some of them were cooperative forms of property that function somewhat under the disguise of jointly owned, like stock companies or whatever it is. And the example that I used was the indigenous economies. So Russia has these huge northern areas, right, that are sparsely populated, but the ones where very many kinds of indigenous people have lived. And their economies are obviously also go back for very, very long time, and they are based on community management and collectivity. They are not capitalist economies at all. They are also not Soviet farms. But if you look at the shape of a lot of reindeer herders cooperatives, for example, they replicate the traditional migration routes. So under the Soviet Union, like those traditional forms kind of seeped in. And if you look at the post-Soviet landscape, so some of the privatized collective farms still have those forms, and now they are in a big conflict with oil and gas industry, because this is what the Soviet post-Soviet state support, going in there and taking those resources away or whatever it is. So my point here is that those forms do survive under different regimes, and what is interesting, they kind of continue to act as means of collective resistance to efforts to destroy them in one way or another. But like my also research here in the United States also focused on credit unions, right? Because this is like a big deal. Turns out in the United States, you have 130 million people being members of credit unions. Out of 320 million of population, this is huge, and nobody thinks of the United States as being like the world leader in credit union movement, but it is. And then I was looking at the situation with them in Russia, and supposedly they did not revive at all. And in the cases when they did, it was in the context of fraud. So I would like to look more into it. I just didn't have time to investigate it. But it's kind of unclear what is going on.
Yes, well, I guess I'm conscious of the time. We have run out, I think. But I wanted to thank you, Mariana, because this was very inspiring, and I have about 10 questions. Maybe there'll be time after in the questions. And I probably should hand over to Marcus. Marcus, it's your go, I think.
Okay, thank you. I will turn on the presentation right now, which I gave a weird title. A renewed post-socialism from the East, approaching the diverse historiographical flavors of Georgia. So I will talk a lot about the First Republic of Georgia today, which existed between 1918 and 1921. And I come already right now to the point why I won't talk so much about the substance of it, but rather about also what is around it, because there is not so much work on it, but this is something I would love to see changed in the future. And I also want to give some reasons why not so many people have heard about Georgia, have never heard about the First Republic today. And why it could be still interesting. And first of all, as many might not be familiar where Georgia lies, I will also want to just simply locate it on a map. So this is a contemporary map of the Caucasus. You see here Georgia in the middle, and the north there is Russia. In the south there is Turkey, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then also Iran. And between the Black and the Caspian Seas. But I also want to speak about this Georgia, the contemporary country of which you see here, and also its multiple paths. I think we also see its past multiple socialisms, and I would also add communisms, that could be actually quite inspiring talking to. But mostly when we talk about this country in Georgia in general, or about socialism in general, something like what you see in the middle, the meme, is confronting me. So here you see, this is from Game of Thrones. Maybe not everyone here knows it, but it was a very popular TV series. On the top, you see a very, let's say, fancy person praising communism and looking happy. And then you see the person with, you know, a knowledge of basic a history and economics who's already more skeptical. And then below you see up the beaten person, Eastern European, who actually experienced socialism. And I think this is this kind of feeling that we also hear through some, you know, personal stories here from Nadia and Mariana, that it's not that nice, and especially if we talk about the real existing socialism. And on the right, you see then also a book from Svetlana Alexievich. I'm not sure if you know her, but she's a quite famous author from Belarus. And she wrote also a book about, let's say, remnants of the socialist past and the present. So it's very similar to probably the book, which I didn't read, that Nadia showed around, which is about kind of fallen promises from the Soviet past and the kind of broken dreams. Yeah, this one that are associated with it. And this is also then something, I think when we talk about post-socialism, we shall really engage with the kind of traumas that were caused by the real existing socialism, but we should also look, and that's what I hope that I can at least partly show, look at more inspiring communism. So first of all, this Georgia and community economies, I first of all ask, is it a failed relation? When we nowadays talk about Georgia, we actually talk mostly about neoliberal developmentalism in its really most radical form that we cannot envision slightly in Germany, with no healthcare, no access, free access to universities, and so on and so forth. So much of the research currently on Georgia centers around either how brutal capitalism works out. On the top, you see like protesters in a manganese factory that was already established during the Russian Empire. And below, you see some Twitter about some, you know, company that built in a more or less desert almond orchard, and people like really championing this development and progress. And we definitely don't have many critical voices about it. Moreover, there is this critique in Georgia that civil society is weak, it's donor-driven, there is nothing authentic there. The only thing that we have are basically sometimes some revolutions that tackle corruption, but usually slightly only changing into another mode of neoliberal development. There is no work using a diverse and community economies perspective on Georgia so far, but there is actually a lot of work on informality, where something, I guess, pops in, but then, of course, there is this lot of stigmatization around the term of informality. So now I want to move backwards. And first of all, I want to say that Georgia became independent in 1991. And before, it used to be a part of the Soviet Union as one of 15 Union republics. And whenever people talk about post-socialism, they usually talk about this period in time when the Soviet Union violently operated Georgia. And what is also important to understand, you see a map below also with two colors within Georgia. Georgia has like two territorial conflicts that stem partly from its Soviet experience. But what I want to focus on is also a socialist predecessor of Bolshevik Georgia, which is like Menshevik Georgia, which is a polity, short-lived, that used to exist for 3 years. You see the flag on the top of it. And basically, to really make it very short, the difference between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, how the faction emerged, was that the Bolsheviks had this idea of the vanguard party with little membership and maybe some sympathizers, whereas the Mensheviks from initially said, no, we have to be a mass movement. We have to be way more accommodating towards non-intellectuals and so on and so forth. And of course, why this republic's existence also has to do with some transnational intellectual entanglement. So many people from the nobility used to live for some time in Warsaw, Leipzig, Berlin, Zurich, and studied there, got acquainted with Marxism. They came back and said, oh my gosh, this is really applicable to the condition of Georgia, because serfdom was only relatively late abolished in the whole Caucasus or in the Russian Empire at large. And in the specific context of Georgia, actually the conditions of peasants very much deteriorated as a consequence of the abolition of serfdom, because with a, let's say, nobility of around 10%, they didn't want to lose all their privileges and kind of try to get the privileges in, not through, let's say, the appropriation of use values as is usual in feudalism, but extracting money from the peasants who were still tied to their lands. So this is, let's say, also the reason why Marxist thought was very influential among peasants in Georgia, although the literacy rate was still relatively low. It was more like oral literacy. Now let's come back to socialism or post-socialism. And I mean, those who are working on post-socialism know one of these papers from Chari Verderi, where they actually also ask defining socialism, what that is. And they say it's a complex matter. We use the term to refer to actual societies characterized by two central features: social ownership of the most important means of production and relative monopoly of political activity by one party, the Communist Party. And many of us working on the so-called post-socialist space are really also dissatisfied that after 30 years, why are we actually still so much referring to post-socialism? I mean, I told you that in Georgia right now, it's like wild neoliberalism. So the continuities with socialism really appear to be strangely thin. Some examples, yeah, they would make sense, but there's really this dissatisfaction. What's the value of still applying this term? But then I think it also has some performative effects to usually look at countries like Georgia only from this angle, because here socialism is defined by two characteristics, and the latter one says one-party rule. So socialism per se is discredited as something dictatorial, if you want to say so, and then also territorial, confined to just a group of countries, usually a Warsaw Pact. And then I ask myself if socialism isn't also a more widespread practice elsewhere, which doesn't actually need a state to be called as such if we only look at means of production and ownership. So basically, I think the cooperative movement about which we heard fulfills the condition of socialism, and it's very democratic as opposed to usual definitions. Now I come closer again to this First Republic. In 1921, the Second International, headed by Karl Kautsky, who was back then the leading Marxist intellectual after the death of Friedrich Engels, went together with a delegation of the Second International to Georgia. And here is a quote from their delegation trip to Georgia. Thus, I went to Georgia to study an interesting and important social experiment, and to draw from it conclusions which would be generally valid for socialist practice. What I studied was the antithesis of Bolshevism. However insignificant it appears, it deserves our attention not less than the Bolshevist experiment with its many sensational reverberations. And I think what for me is important here is rather the second part, because the third part was, as community economy scholars, I think we should be not so much concerned with universally valid templates, but we should be very, I think we are all concerned of kind of revaluing, highlighting practices that appear insignificant, but that could be still important. But so the question is, when leading intellectual Marxists in 1921 asked this question, why don't we know so much about the Georgian First Republic today? And now I come to the, let's say, complex contemporary historiography.
4 more minutes.
Okay, I'll go ahead. So the first problem probably is that it was only 3 years. And when this book by Kautsky was finished, the Soviet Union violently came into power. The Mensheviks were declared enemies of the people. And during the Soviet Union, there was not much talk on this issue anymore. Many scholars currently, after 1991, are revisiting this Bolshevik Georgia, but it's very marginal compared to, Golden Age, which was 11th, 12th century, Great Terror, which are Stalinist purges in the 1930s, and then also ethnogenesis and inter-ethnic conflicts. And here we come back again to these territorial conflicts. In the middle, you see like a settlement of internally displaced persons. And historiography nowadays is very much about, legitimizing also why Georgia needs political independence, mainly from Russia, why it needs territorial integrity, including its breakaway territories. There is a lot of research on military history and diplomacy, but actually there are only very few historians who identify the civic engagement, socialist polity, and practice to challenge also the current neoliberal developmentalist paradigms there. And what is also weird that this often, there are really only few Georgian researchers, and those who are interested more normatively in this, let's say, challenges to neoliberalism are often like foreign scholars like I, and you see one recent publication about the issue, but you wouldn't find else much. So now I give you a bit more substance, the only substance I have, based on secondary literature, because there is nothing about it. What I just tried to say, why there is also nothing. So I think the first interesting thing also is that this Social Democratic Party initially didn't seek any kind of independence from Russia, which is the current historiography, but they sought autonomy within Russia, and they're very internationalist in its scope, really believed in the kind of international proletariat. It was a democracy. This is really important, I think, to emphasize. It has nothing to do with the one-party state definition of socialism. It was a multi-party system, dominated, however, by one political party, namely the Social Democratic Party of Georgia, with around 80% of votes. Land was not like in the Soviet Union, completely in state hand, but which made also the Mensheviks very popular. It was redistributed to peasant households, and it was a mixed formal economy with private enterprises, a lot of cooperatives, which come next. So basically, also here in Georgia, apparently we have a big cooperative tradition, but I spoke with the researchers who are most well versed in this topic, and there is no research on it yet. There are archives, you can access them, but so far the only thing from 2018 here, but it's still valid, is this kind of information that it could have been in a population of around 3 million persons, 1 million members of cooperatives. So pretty much the same ratio that Mariana had right now with the credit unions in the US. And then I think what is for me most interesting, they also had something like local self-government reforms, which was called Erba, which was, I think, way more radical than anything we see nowadays, not even in Georgia, but also, Germany, which often claims we have this nice federal system and everything is so decentralized. But here, really, everything was regulated in the local level. I think I now have to be very quick. I have 2 slides left. So why all this? For whom do we need to revalue the past? And I first of all start with Georgia and with those people who look at the First Republic and what happened before. And this quote is large, but I still want to read it out. We believe that remembering and bringing positive historical experience to the fore through highlighting traditions and memories of public activism then can become a powerful instrument for overcoming the nihilism that is dominating public attitudes today. We also believe that reminding the public that historically both urban and rural communities have been actively involved in promoting self-government, and that civic participation and self-organization have been part of the country's culture, is likely to enable communities to regain faith in themselves, the faith that if it was possible a century ago, it is possible now, provided there is a strong will and openness for communities to take a lead. And looking at the time, I think I will just skip here also the other slides. And yeah, thank you first of all very much for your attention. I think what I hoped to show is just that there is more than the one party socialism or communism out there, even in what is usually labeled the post-communist world.
Okay. Well, thanks. So, discussion, please. Yes, please, Mariana.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about what is left out of the Soviet experience, and by which I mean, you know, going right up to Berlin and East Central Europe as well. When I was at uni, I read Victor Serge's book, Memoirs of a Revolutionary, and he was absolutely arguing that, you know, in the early days of the Soviet Union, what should have been done was to work on all these existing communal organizations, and that was very much sort of the Menshevik view, and you know, the People's Will, the Narodniks as well, arguing for the Mirs and everything like that. But Lenin seems to have been just in love with the German war economy, and just wanting to literally centralize absolutely everything, and taking the view that this is really easy. Once you get rid of the capitalists who provide no value whatsoever, it's an accounting job. Any ordinary worker can do it. You can just organize it. You can develop the country, and everything will be okay. And when you look at a massive country like Russia, 1/6 of the world, yeah, there was lots of, you know, communal stuff going on, but wasn't there also, you know, great poverty and great exploitation? And I think you can be a little bit romantic about rural practices, and I think there's something about the idea of electrification and Soviets and a way to develop 1/6 of the world that wasn't developed. So Alec Nove, I mean, he and Vosmir Brus, they basically argue that state planning was a way to develop places that hadn't been developed, like the capitalist West was. And it's best to see that experience as a great developmentalist job, which leads us into all the, you know, the post-development thinking that there is now, you know, that you see development as just one big hoax and totalitarian. So I wonder how much it is that we want to be looking back at the past, or thinking that we need to think about post-development thinking but also being cognizant of the history. Whereas, so in places, is it more, yeah, we need to think about markets more? I don't know. Sorry, that was very, very rambling. Is it that the problem is this modernist hubris of state planning? That's what's gone, and that's like the postmodern critique, isn't it? That we all buy into with our, you know, post-foundational thinking. And is that good enough given the climate crisis? Do we want a bit more state planning back? I don't know. Sorry, that was just rambling, but I'm just so inspired by everybody's contributions.
So Marcus, do you want to react?
I see this rather also as a point for discussion, maybe for the general discussion. So maybe we can put it also here or in that. If there is nothing else with regard to questions, we could also move there already. I don't know.
I think Mariana had a question, and Tom as well. No, Mariana, some
Yeah,
comments?
thank you. I just wanted to mention, yeah, and I have a lot to say also in response to Pete's comment, but I was going to ask a clarifying question to Marcus. I really appreciate that you brought up that period, you know, pre-Stalinist period. So it would be the period when, you know, October Revolution happened, Georgia became kind of, you know, part of that whole thing. But at the same time, that was still exceptionally vibrant time of experimentation and everything. And it seems like what happened like in late 1920s and 1930s is that all this experimentation was totally erased, and there was only kind of one way of doing things imposed. And connecting to Pete's comment, my view of the Soviet system actually is that it is very, very complex. I think that there is a lot that we can gain as a society from state ownership of a lot of things. The key is that we need to control the state as opposed to letting the state or people who get into the state, to define everything. And when the side of people's interest is lost. But I'm actually, I don't find this kind of calls to withdraw from the state in the West, let's say, not participate in it or whatever, very, very productive and useful, because you just leave it up for grabs. And bad people, they will go there and they will use the state for their own interest. No problem. This is how it has been happening. But this is not to say, well, and also Soviet state did make very, very important contributions to social security of people, like, full employment. Excuse me, we had free healthcare, we had public education, like all those things. In the West, in the United States, people don't even think that it is their right. They kind of don't think of it as something that is actually a human norm. And there were many problems with it, of course, but we should separate, those kind of things that it is possible to do that serve the interests of people, and the ones that come from the totalitarian nature of the state. So we need to separate the economy and political system. Those two are not as intertwined as we have been made to believe at all. So that's why it is, going back to Georgia, it's kind of uplifting to see that there was this period when a lot of kind of more democratic forms of self-governance that were not exploitative necessarily were also encouraged.
Okay, thank you. I think, yeah, that's great. Well, and now I guess it's time for Lucy and her intervention, isn't it?
Tom, did you have? Oh, you had to leave. Yeah, so my intention for this intervention was actually to collect some keywords from the audience, and then out of those keywords generate a poem. And I was going to do that while also taking a brief break, but I also wanted to check in on how you all want to proceed, seeing that there's only 20 minutes left in the session. So if you still want to take a quick break, or if you would rather push forward.
Maybe we could take 2 or 3 minutes.
Yeah, I could do with just nipping to the loo.
All right, let's
think of a keyword while we're away, and then just collect those, as there are already 6 of us.
Yeah, or you can even throw them in the chat already if you have one, and then in the meantime also indeed take like a quick comfort break.
So should we put the keywords into the chat?
Yes, please.
And the keywords are supposed to comment on the discussion so far?
Yeah, just like a couple of or a couple of words that resonate with you, or that would summarize your impressions, takeaways from the discussion so far.
Okay.
Thank you.
Then we'll be back in 2 minutes or 3 minutes?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. So are we all here? Not yet. Looks
Not yet.
like
Not sure if Ellie's there or not. Or are you there, Ellie? Yeah, she is.
Pete, did you still have words for keywords, key
Yeah,
takeaways?
keywords. Yeah. So my keyword would be socialism.
All right.
I found it hard to come up with keywords specifically. It seems like, you know, you want to put together several words, kind of string them together. I like this commemorating.
Mm.
All right.
Were we supposed to put, oh, we put it in the chat. Okay.
Thanks for this. So this was an experiment. And I do need to credit artificial intelligence in helping me come up with this. But here's a poem on this session, which I'm gonna post in the chat. I will also read it out loud. It's a bit cheesy. That's the artificial intelligence, not me. And it's called Commemorating Community Economies. Exposed to Marxism, pondering the people's quest, I'm on a journey, curious and unimpressed. Eroba and Artel, echoes of history's plan, reactivate this past to empower the present, understand. Hidden in corners, recognize past traumas hold. Redefine socialism, a story yet to be told. Cooperatives, authentically cool, lead the way to a future where community economies have their say. Living in the cracks, short circuits to explore, politics of history reimagined, and more. Kampelichka's bloom, a symbol, a clue to a world where solidarity and dreams come true.
I mean that the artificial intelligence invented this? Is that it?
Well, I've been kind of collecting like keywords and phrases that resonated with me throughout the session, and then adding yours, what you came up with, and then yeah, the AI generated kind of the template of it and the parts that are actually rhyming, and I then went in and made some
Interesting
edits to that still.
Wait, so did you write it or did the artificial intelligence write it? Sorry, I'm obtuse, but
I wrote it with the support of artificial intelligence.
unbelievable. Wow. Wow.
Lucy, thanks for admitting it.
So that's the summary to start from, I guess.
Okay, well, and we have 13 minutes left, right? So do we want to talk about our book then? Because we had an idea that we might edit a book on this, you know, what this poem says, really.
I have a question. Do you know of somebody who does research on former Yugoslavia? Because I think that was the country where specifically worker cooperatives were essential to the economic system.
Yeah.
As opposed to, for example, former Soviet Union, where you did not have worker cooperatives at all. They were all like, you know, put on chopping block. But that would be interesting to kind of bring on board.
That's what's missing from this, isn't it? Yugoslavia.
Mark,
I do know people. I don't know anybody in CERN that's doing that. It's I've got a couple of sort of names that I've come across over the years. I was a part of a network. I don't know if people know Dario Azzolini. I was part of a network funded by the European Green Left, which had quite a few sort of ex-communists involved in it that, you know, wanted to rethink what socialism means, given that it's not state socialism anymore. Thoughtful people. And we went to some conferences in different places, and there was some people there looking at Yugoslavia, including a delegation from a a factory in Belgrade that they wanted to close, and they recovered it. So yeah, I mean that's what's missing, isn't it? So I'm not sure we got enough people for a book, but we could put something out and see if there are more people want to get involved, or it could be sort of if we wanted to write something about particularly about diverse economies and socialism. I mean, it might be that sort of we have 4 papers in Rethinking Marxism with a top and tails with a commentary. That might be that might be something worth thinking about, or communist and post-communist studies, Eurasian geographies.
Well, what I would really be interested in would be the pre-socialist entities, or like what Marcus was speaking about, and the Mensheviks, because I had no idea actually that this was existing. And also the Mir, I found that really so inspiring, and I had heard about it before. There was this guy writing about it, but it was in Russian. I actually had even copied the text, but I never managed to read it. And what is really fascinating for me is sort of drawing the threads of a former of an original philosophy, which I brought these 2 books here, which we probably all know, but one is The Moral Economy of the Peasant by James C. Scott, who sort of explains, based on meticulous research in South Asia, the ethos. Sorry, was somebody saying something? The ethos of the peasant in South Asia, which was really finding a livelihood, surviving, and very risk averse in a way. But the important thing is to survive. And he used the term moral economy based on the work of E.E.P. Thompson, who was writing about the making of the English working class. And he sort of speaks about a certain moral economy which was there before capitalists took over, and he gives some fantastic examples from people's uprisings at that time, who actually took the bread away from the bakers who charged too much for it on the black market, and they sold the bread for a fair price, and then they gave back the proceedings to the bakers. So this kind of, and I think this is something which keeps cropping up again in these, and there are so many examples, not necessarily even from the Eastern Europe, but I think here it's most submerged, and most of all it's not known. So so it would be so interesting for me to put together some kind of edited volume on case studies, really, of these alternatives, which were not named as such, maybe, or were named, but then were rolled over by the juggernaut of the state socialism, and to somehow link it to these more general ideas of the fair price and of the because there are so many examples of this, but they are not known, and they are not discussed in our corner of the world. So that's what I really would find very, very interesting. Ellie is writing. I think Sonia Novkovic published on co-ops in Yugoslavia.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Do you all know her, or so? Is she a CERN member, or no? Any contact? Yeah, of course they could be. Yeah, Ellie, hello. We don't hear you.
yeah, you are muted.
We can't
We
hear
can't hear
you.
any.
Don't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Yeah, she's really big in terms of cooperative studies. So she's in St. Mary's University in Canada, and she's written quite a lot on democratic governance and worker cooperatives. And I think she has a paper. If you check her academia, she has a paper on Yugoslavia, and also loads of kind of different papers on Croatia. So she might be, she might be someone to contact, because anyone
Excellent.
doing co-op studies will kind of know her.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I also posted a link in the chat to the work of Milica Kočović de Santos. She spoke at the Degrowth Conference in Zagreb. I don't know, Marcus, if you also heard her presentation. And I mean, the talk was actually called The Unwritten Yugoslavian History of Degrowth. No, but I mean, I think we can also replace degrowth with community economies here, because I mean, in essence, it's a similar idea of living well together in like a self-organized way. And her talk was amazing in the sense that it's so rare to kind of hear Eastern European examples as kind of examples of good practice, and it was really refreshing. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah.
Mariana, I see that you have your hand up. I didn't mean to skip.
Yeah, sorry, excuse me. Yeah, I wanted to kind of second what Nadia said in terms of having this kind of focus on the past forms of community economies. I'm interested in kind of digging in, but with an eye to the future, you know, kind of asking this big question whether some of those forms of the past could be a foundation of building something for the future. So they are not new because they already were there, right? But at the same time, they can be a foundation for building something new, because like things don't repeat themselves, right? It's not like we want to go like, you know, excavate even good cadaver or something like that and put it back in action. This is something different. This is like to stimulate people's imagination, to kind of see, to show that there are other ways to be in this world, right? Ways that are not based on exploitation, on patriarchy, on racism, like all these horrible things, right? So I think that's important, but also, as Nadia said, it is important to also show that these are economies of survival. So they're both kind of economies of survival and also means of building the future for from our perspective, where we are today in our history. And the fact that they are economies of survival actually shows that this is what enabled societies to survive. So this is not just kind of, you know, oh, people survive and then they start doing something else. Actually, those practices of survival, they are very, very important. And it seems like they have served humanity well for much longer than capitalism or statist totalitarian approach or something like that. So it's very, I think it's I'm just trying to think how to repackage it, how to make it sound not like something in the past, but something which is so relevant to today and to the future as well.
Exactly, as you say. Well, I'm conscious we have only 3 minutes. Does anybody know if it sort of just stops, or do we go on, or does it collapse in 3 minutes? The Zoom? It may.
I don't know. I
Because
mean, there's not many of us. We can carry on the discussion by email, or we can have another meeting at another time.
Ellie, would you like to be part of the discussion? If we get into some email discussion on this future project, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested in the idea of commemorating. I don't do research on Eastern Europe, though I do research on Ireland, so very, very different kind of,
On
setting.
Ireland? Ireland, did you say?
Ireland, yeah.
Yeah, well, it doesn't need to all be Eastern Europe necessarily. We never.
Okay. So, but yeah, no, I was very interested by this conversation. I think what Mariana said as well about commemorating is something that comes from a paper that I've read on Rogers and Al, which were doing things on Finnish towns in the US. And it's this idea that we don't commemorate alternative organizations. And by commemorating them, teaching them, kind of digging into that history, we also kind of shatter the idea of capitalism as a cohesive, sole dominant story. So I really like that kind of aspect. And I think anyone who works with co-ops tends to do that. And it kind of made me think about reinventing the wheel as well, which is another thing Mariana has said. And I think when you work with co-ops, you realize that co-ops have such a long history. And maybe that's something that's a little bit different from people doing research on social enterprises. But
See.
you know, this idea of reinventing the wheel all the time and trying to find new models, well, actually, co-ops have been there, you know, for thousands of years. There's a report by Cooperatives UK done by Ed Mayo, where he looked at the history of co-ops and is kind of going through, and artels are mentioned in it. It's an interesting report in terms of historical research that I'd refer to, because it's a worldwide kind of report. So yeah, there's loads of things I'd like to mention. I know we're running out of time, but I found this very, very interesting.
So do we, at some point, do we sort of, the 6 of us, should I write, for example, and is anybody able to make a doodle for that we can discuss it again? Is that a good idea, you think, or no?
I think so. I think so. I mean, I think we got a few decisions that we need to make about where we're going to go with this. And I'd say this has been a really good meeting. I know, Ellie, you've also got, you know, you do your stuff where you go to Spain for the Civil War memorials as well, don't you? So I know you've got interests on that side as well. Ellie and I have worked together on Ellie's PhD, Mariana. So we've known each other for some time.
And Lucy, are you
We seem to
interested?
have gone away, do we? We would have gone away now if we were going to.
Yeah, yeah. So far, it's not stopping us. Lucy, do you have an interest in being a part of this group? Forming itself slowly, maybe?
I mean, I find it interesting as an outsider, rather. I find it fascinating, but I also know that I won't be able to contribute in the sense of actually doing research on these past practices. So I would find it very interesting to follow, but I don't think I will have much to add to it.
I see. Okay, well, so I'll send out an email. I'll include maybe Tom as well, right? And then somebody of you can make a doodle. I'm not very good at that, and we could decide on another discussion maybe.
I don't think we've got a book yet. I think we've got, you know, 4 interesting papers that we could broaden out to Yugoslavia. Well, if we're talking about past practices, I'd want to include communist past practices, because I have done some stuff about the cooperative history in Poland, and the early days of the Second Republic, which was just like Menshevik Georgia. And the Polish left looks back to the beginnings of the Polish Republic before the coup of 1926 as a social democratic Poland that's important. But yeah, I mean, my interest is more the People's Republic experience and the discussions about workers' involvement from, you know, a communist ideology perspective, looking at what should be state, what should be markets. I think we'd also need to think about, is this specifically about diverse economies perspectives? So I don't know whether the people about Yugoslavia that we've spoken to talk about that, or do we talk generally about living well in the Anthropocene, which would be degrowth, which would be all sorts of ways that broaden it, wouldn't it, rather than diverse economies thinking, and that's, you know, that's the anti-essentialism and there's specific things that diverse economies does that others might not in the same way.
Well, my feeling is we could just, you know, leave it a bit broad rather, because everybody is coming from a slightly different perspective, but the unifying moment would be how to change the system, really, how to come to some kind of transition on this practical level. And you can then each person can frame it different, but I think it's important that we all together have perhaps this assumption that there's something very wrong with the world and we are looking for an alternative, and can be inspired by these traditional or not traditional, but the historical alternatives and how they speak to the present maybe. So that would be the connecting point. And then if somebody is closer to the diverse economy perspective, they can use that in their paper. And it's not necessarily, I think what is important is that we are, maybe I'm wrong, but we are more on the radical, we're not the ecological modernization sort of, you know, superficial kind of approach. We are getting into this more deeply. I'm not sure if I'm saying it understandably, but
know what you mean. We're not taking the modernist hubristic perspective.
yeah, something that
Yeah,
I mean,
I think it's good to keep it maybe a little bit open in the sense that, you know, this is not like we have 10 case studies or something like that. We have relatively small number, and each of them could contribute theoretically as well as empirically, right? Kind of what do we learn from the past, whatever you define this past, like, you know, with an eye to the future. What do we learn from the past if we want to, I don't know, compare, make an effort to build a better future? Given what is happening in the world today, I find it kind of very, both very, very sad, but at the same time very necessary, you know, to keep talking about those things.
I mean, we could write a call for chapters and put it out on Critical Geography Forum and CERN and see what comes in, couldn't we? You know, to keep it broader, or have a call for a conference sometime and see what comes in. We could write to these people looking at Yugoslavia.
Yeah, well, let's decide before we write something. We have to decide more what we actually want, and I think we need to think it over more and discuss it some more before we actually. But otherwise, I think it's a good idea to try to find other people interested in this. But first, we have to decide what. I mean, some basic points maybe, like essentially what Mariana and Pete said, but maybe just sort of chew it a bit more in our heads and formulate it a bit more.
We can certainly bounce around a couple of paragraphs, you know, similar to what we did for this call, didn't we? I mean, we can use what we've already got on the website and develop it a bit further.
So do we want another discussion, or will we communicate by email?
We can probably find time for another discussion, but also I'm thinking, so do we want to keep regional focus on post-socialism, or do we want to open it wider than that? Because, like, you know, looking into the past with an eye in the future, this is one thing, but the other thing is the experience of post-socialist countries. And some people kind of think that it's not a defining experience and we shouldn't even be talking about post-socialism today. I personally think that those societies went through this whole trauma of trying to be something different in the world, and then kind of being so deeply disappointed in themselves and the whole experiment, and now kind of having a like very, very hard time, but also probably realizing that it is necessary to come back to those experiences and learn from them as well, which makes it important, you know, to look not only pre-Soviet but also Soviet era experiences. So I agree with Pete in that kind of way. So
well, maybe we could just have post-socialism or the socialist countries as a basis, but have subaltern countries like Ireland. Ireland was a colony in a way, and it was also marginalized. So the experience of these marginalized countries who have maybe an inferiority complex a little bit, to tell them, well, look, what you're doing is great, and you know, it can be a model for the future, and something like that. It doesn't have to be only the post-socialists, but they would be the core, because obviously that's how we began, right? And they are certainly among the least studied, but they're not the only ones.
I mean, I don't personally take a sort of a regional view, because I don't think I want to become like a Poland specialist. I'm interested in the difference in different places as a geographer, between places that have got different historical traditions that inform but don't dominate or don't set into stone, or I'm interested in the different historical circumstances that inform what people think about the future. So, you know, Argentina with its legacies of anarchism from Italy and Spain is very different from United States with its racialized history that you see in the US solidarity economy movements that, you know, engages with that. I think that's very different in Spain with its history of Franco. The role of communists in the liberation movements in France, Spain, Italy, I think that matters. The different experiences of what people think of as communism. So for me, the organizing thing would be the ways that different experiences of and views about what communism is, the way that informs ways of thinking about living well in the Anthropocene. Now, so Yugoslavia, I mean, it's, and I don't know, Marianne, if you think this as well, but Yugoslavia is very, very clear that that's not a colonial situation. You know, the Yugoslavs liberated themselves through their partisan army, and they're very proud of that. And you hear about that from Yugoslavs. You know, they want to think of themselves as Yugoslavs, and the terrible experience of the war, of the Yugoslav succession, affects things. You know, I don't know. You said with quite proudness, Mariana, we had proper education, we had proper social services. These things matter. Whereas a Pole, I think I'd struggle to hear a Pole saying that, because they just hear Soviet occupation. That's all they'd say. And there are Polish socialists, Polish Stalinists, Polish communists that do say that, and they get shouted down for saying that. And I think that matters. So for me, I'm not. So that's why I'm perhaps less interested in the 19th century experience of Poland for itself, but I'm interested in ways that people deployed different histories in discussing what a future, better world looks like.
Well, that's slightly different, slightly an outlier, but it could be interesting.
I don't think so, Nadia. I don't think it's an outlier. I think that's sort of the broader idea of these things is, you know, different reactions to communism.
Well, in a sense, it could be thought of, no matter what you are looking at, let's say pre-Soviet or Soviet era experiences, but these are exactly discourses of economic difference that we are trying to kind of bring to light and see what kind of work they are going to do possibly for the future, how they create conditions of possibility. And of course, Irish, Eli, I just wanted to say, Irish experience is also kind of, you know, part of those things. And Pete, I think you are right. Different countries, even though the ones, and even maybe more so than the ones that call themselves socialist officially, engaged with socialist thinking and communist thinking and possibility for very, very long time. And this is probably what also created certain societal institutions that today do better job than others, let me put it this way, to support people and provide for the future. But there is this kind of want for something more different. Do you know what I mean? It's like what else can we do? How can we do something a little bit more creatively? But let's look at some forms that we already have instead of inventing necessarily the new ones. We can leave it to science fiction writers, so they will be good. But
Marcus, you've been quite quiet. Did you have any thoughts?
I find this discussion super interesting. I just would, looking at the time, really propose that I will make a doodle to figure out. I'm sorry for making this right now like this, but I really also have to leave very soon to make a doodle to discuss it in more detail. I mean, I can see many of these things going in a really good direction. For me, the question is really like, yeah, certain inside, certain outside, post-socialist, or bringing new cases in. That's for me like really the big things. And I think it needs a bit time for discussing somehow. I just didn't plan also right now to really go already into that discussion, but I would I would love to maybe make them just a doodle somehow.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah. Should we finish it now then and set up a doodle? And
yes,
you know, You
collect
see-
walnuts as part of the subsistence economy. About 3 layers of walnuts fallen from the trees, and nobody's been collecting them like for 5 days. And it will get dark in 45 minutes.
Mm,